Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with James Boughton on the topic of the international financial system and whether or not it can be saved. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of international affairs here to the studio in Waterloo. Today, my guest is James Boughton. He is a senior fellow here at CIGI as well, and the former historian for the International Monetary Fund. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Andrew. It's good to be here.
James, I wonder if we could just start asking, what is broken with the international financial system? What is the current landscape looking like?
The current landscape is, I think most people agree, is not very favorable. We've had 40 years of instability in international finance, and every effort to try to fix it has not really taken us very far. And I think what people are coming to realize is that the threats to economic growth and stability in the world are not confined to the poorer countries. They affect all of us. They affect Canada, they affect the United States, they affect Europe and the developed parts of Asia as well. So it's a threat to everybody, and I think that now is really the time for people to take a closer look at what can be done about it.
And in the paper that you recently wrote for CIGI with the title, The International Financial System, Can It Be Saved? You point to the 1970s as a really critical moment in the history of international finance. What happened in the 70s that was so important?
Well, what happened in the 70s was a collapse of the system that had been set up in the 1940s. At the end of World War II, the United States was by far the dominant economic and financial power in the world. And so a system was set up that was based on the US dollar as the sole central currency in the system. And over the next 25 years, as other countries regained their place in the world economy and began to grow rapidly and participate in international trade and finance, a system based just on the US dollar was no longer viable. So that system broke down in the early 1970s. And what replaced it was a system that was much more flexible, much more open, much more enabling to other currencies. And so it had the potential of being a more dynamic and a more successful economic system, one that was better suited to lead us into the 21st century. And what we've actually seen as a result is we have, in fact, had much more exchange of financial capital around the world. Right. We've had more international trade. Economic trade has continued to grow at very rapid rates, more than 10% a year globally. Right. But we've seen a marked slowdown in world economic growth. And that, if you think about it, that's a really awful outcome. Sure. I mean, that you set up a system that is designed to give you better results. And in fact, in terms of the real economy, you get worse results.
Well, and in your paper, you point to a number of policy failures, beginning in the 70s, continuing into the 80s with the new Anglo-Saxon paradigm, financial deregulation in the 1990s. Can you say a little bit about these various policies and then why they contributed so much to volatility?
Surely. I think two things I think are very important here. One is that we gradually, particularly by the 1980s, I think policymakers around the world lost sight of the fact that their primary responsibility in conducting monetary, fiscal, exchange rate policies should be to try to promote economic growth and high employment. Instead, there's been an excessive focus on trying to have financial stability in terms of low fiscal deficits, fighting inflation, and so on. And those goals are important, but they're not the only goals in the world. And I think losing sight of the primary goals of growth and employment has had very deleterious effects on the system. That's one big failing. And then another big failing has been a fascination with deregulation. It's true that in the first part of the post-war period, there was excessive regulation in many sectors. But by the 1980s and 1990s, much of the world had swung way too far in the other direction. Deregulate everything. Let the private sector flourish.
Right.
And the private sector has flourished, but it hasn't led to better growth or more financial stability even.
Right. And we've had, since the 70s, several financial crises of various degrees of severity, of course the biggest being the 2008 crisis. Are we learning from these events? And are we learning the right lessons from these events?
I think by now there is at least the beginnings of awareness of what the right lessons are from what we've gone through. I think most countries now are pulling back from total deregulation. There's a recognition that financial markets need to be overseen pretty carefully. Economists like to talk about the invisible hand, that markets will reach equilibrium if left to their own.
Right.
But we now know that there is no invisible hand in financial markets because financial markets are dominated by speculators, and speculators make money off volatility. They don't make money off moving the system toward a stable equilibrium.
Right.
So I think that lesson is being learned. The setting up of the Financial Stability Board is one evidence of that. Efforts to the Dodd-Frank law in the United States, and so on. There are a number of things that show that countries are, in a cautious way, moving back toward appropriate regulation and regulation of and management of international capital flows is another thing that we're beginning to see. In 2010, the IMF put out a notice that they were, as they put it, putting capital controls back into the policy toolkit.
Okay.
So they're even encouraging at least some countries to regulate capital flows more actively. And I think these are very positive steps in the right direction. And some countries are beginning to recognize that monetary and fiscal policies have to be aimed at full employment, not just at price stability.
Right. One of the things I found really fascinating about your paper is that you're quite critical of the G20. And of course, the G20 comes out of the 2008 financial crisis. And you're quite critical, specifically with respect to its relationship with the International Monetary Fund. What led you to this conclusion?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to recognize the G20 was a major advance over what came before it in terms of inclusiveness. Before the G20 was set up in 1999, the main body, informal group of advanced economies where the finance officials and political leaders would get together was the G7. So it was a small group of leading countries who would get together and issue pronouncements about how they thought the world economy should be organized.
Right.
So the problem was that group left out the large emerging market countries, what we now call the BRICS.
Right.
Brazil wasn't there, Russia wasn't there, India wasn't there, and China wasn't there. Major important countries in the world and rapidly growing countries. So the creation of the G20 brought all these other countries in. It's called the G20. It's actually 19 countries plus the European Union.
Right.
But my point is that this is still a small subset of the whole world. The G20 countries control most of world trade and world finance, but there are still 150 or more countries that are not in there. And what's the characteristic of those countries? They're mostly poor countries, and they're mostly very small countries.
Right.
And what people, I think, lose sight of is that the interests of poor countries and small countries are different from those of the G20, and they're systemically important.
Right.
Now, why are small countries systemically important? You can look at, say, Jamaica and say, well, no, Jamaica's not systemically important. Or you look at Uganda. Uganda's not systemically important by itself, but as a group, those countries are important because those countries, at least some of them, will be the emerging markets of tomorrow, of the next decade, and the decade after that. And so if we're not looking after the interests and the legitimate needs of those countries today, then we're going to have more trouble 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So I think there's a problem of ignoring or at least not paying enough attention to some very important problems in the world. So that's one problem. The second problem with the G20 is that it's an informal, self-appointed, self-organized group of countries. Separately from that, we have formal treaty-based institutions that have been in existence for 70 years and that play an incredibly important role in the world economy. And for finance purposes, that institution is the International Monetary Fund. So what happens in the relationship between these two? When the G7 was the main group of leading countries that was interacting with the IMF, they would issue a pronouncement, and they had, a little less than 50% of the voting power in the IMF. Now, the IMF wants to establish a consensus solution that will benefit the world economy. So there'd be another group of countries, and it was usually the G24, which is a group of developing countries, poorer countries. And the G24 would also meet a couple of times a year and issue communiques like those of the G7. So the G24 and the G7 would each issue views about what should happen. They would come together in the IMF. This group is called the International Monetary and Financial Committee, or the IMFC. And in the IMFC, you have representatives of both of these groups, the poorer countries and the richer countries. And they would talk and hammer out a consensus solution that would benefit the world. Okay, now what do you have? You have the G20, which controls over 3/4 of the voting power in the IMF. So once they issue a communique and they say, here's what we think should happen, that's the end of the story. And all that the IMF can do is just approve and implement decisions taken by the G20. So there's both a real problem in the world of ignoring the needs of those other countries and an institutional problem that the role of the IMF is being diminished. And I think it's not being diminished to anybody's real benefit, and because it leads to a less stable solution.
Now, you do in your paper suggest that there's an opportunity for the G20 to be reformed. What do you have in mind?
Well, I think both the IMF and the G20 are in need of reform. The IMF is characterized by a lot of inertia. It was set up in 1944, and it has a set of articles of agreement, its basic charter that controls how it evolves over time. And it's evolved a lot over time, but it's always catching up. It's always behind what's really going on in the world economy. And so the IMF, people in the IMF are trying very hard to update the way it's governed, update the way it operates, to make it fit the needs of the world economy better. So I think there's a process for reform of the IMF that is ongoing and needs to be pursued and even accelerated. Now, turning to the G20, I think one way to alleviate the shortcomings that I've just described would be for the G20 to develop what's called a constituency structure. So, for example, in the IMF, Brazil has a seat at the executive board table. And in that seat, Brazil represents a group of countries around Latin America. So all of the countries that are members of the IMF, and there are 188 of them, are all represented in some fashion through this constituency structure at the executive board. The G20 has a little bit of a constituency structure because the European Union is a member. So countries in the European Union may not have a direct seat at the table, but they're represented by the European Commission. Now, there's no reason the G20 couldn't extend that in other ways, so that Brazil, which is a member of the G20, could represent Latin American countries more broadly and have a formal way to speak for the interests of the countries that are not otherwise at the table. So developing a constituency structure in the G20 is one thing that could be important. But I think looking beyond that, there has to be a better relationship between the G20 and the IMF. Some people have put out proposals to somehow merge the two. But I like to think of it as trying to make the G20 a little bit more like the IMF and try to make the IMF a little bit more like the G20 so that there's more balance between the two. So, for example, the fact that the IMFC is a very formal, structured institution is both an advantage and a disadvantage. And it's an advantage because everybody knows what the role is and it has a specific mandate to achieve certain things. But it's a disadvantage because anything that's formal just tends to become routine after a while, right? So if you make it a little bit less formal and make it more adaptable so that it's not, you don't have the same group, same countries at the table all the time, right? And you increase the role of countries like China that are growing very rapidly, and you decrease the role of some of the countries in Europe that are not growing so rapidly. And that are overrepresented today on the IMFC. So making the IMFC more flexible, bringing it more up to date, enabling it to change more rapidly when the world economy changes. And then maybe have joint meetings between the IMFC and the G20 so that you increase the visibility and the role of the IMFC and sort of reestablish its real role in the world economy. I think these are all things that could go a long way toward making the system work more effectively.
And beyond our existing institutions and informal meetings like the G20, what else needs to happen in order to bring stability to the international financial system?
You know, I think that there's been a lot of talk over the years about having some kind of a grand conference of countries. You know, people usually call this Bretton Woods II, you know, because in the 20th century, the only monetary conference that fully succeeded in achieving its objectives and really making a difference in the way the system works was the conference of 44 countries that met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. So there's this nostalgia about Bretton Woods, right? We need to recreate that momentum and that multilateral drive that was present at Bretton Woods. I've studied these problems for 30 or 40 years now. I don't think it's going to happen. You know, there have been a lot of efforts all across the political spectrum. Ronald Reagan called for a Bretton Woods II. Francois Mitterrand called for a Bretton Woods II. You know, opposite ends of the political spectrum. They all wanted to have something that you could have a magic wand that people would say, we're all going to get together and design a new system and it's going to work better. Let's assume that's not going to happen, because I really don't think it's going to. Then what we really need to do is think about incremental changes, the kinds of things I've talked about. Better policy making around the world. I think you can get better policy making by using the existing institutions to make sure that policymakers do talk about what works and what doesn't work. And what are the spillovers? You know, the United States needs to know not only how its policies affect its own economy, but how its policies affect other countries. And that happens in forums like the IMF or the OECD or other groups, you know, the Asia Pacific Forum that the United States participates in. I think that's a very good thing. I think if we continue to promote those things, make them work better, that has a big effect. So you get better policy making, you continue with this move to re-regulate a lot of private sector activity. Not to stifle it, but to make it more stable.
Right.
And then do some of these institutional reforms. I know these seem like small incremental changes, but I think what I tried to show in my essay for CIGI is that if you do a lot of incremental changes, you can make the whole system work a lot better.
And is there anything that's holding up these reforms, that's making them difficult to implement?
Inertia, particularly when you're making institutional changes.
Right.
It's not a zero-sum game because the whole system in the end works better. But there's a sense in which it's a zero-sum game. So for example, when you're trying to reform the IMF, you're trying to give more of a role to these fast-growing emerging market countries like China and India. The more traditional powers have less influence,
sure.
right? And it hits the smaller European countries particularly hard.
Right.
And Europe is under siege right now, right? Because the whole euro area is not functioning very well.
Right.
And so, you know, you got to hit a guy when he's down, and nobody wants to do that. So there has to be an acceptance that that less influence today is okay because it's going to make the whole system work better, and therefore right. We're all going to be better off in the end. But it's a hard sell.
Sure.
But I think I'm hopeful about it because if you listen to what people are saying and when there are meetings at the IMF, there's a growing acceptance that things need to change, and I think there is some momentum going now. So I'm hopeful that over time we're going to make this very diffuse kind of almost amorphous system that we have. We're going to continue to find ways to make it work better.
Well, then, you know, perhaps just to wrap up, I'll come back to the title of your essay. Can the international financial system actually be saved?
I think it can be saved if we recognize that that the system we have is the system we're going to continue to have. You know, we've had something that could be called an international financial system for about a century and a half, going back to when the international gold standard right. Was in effect before World War I. So we had the gold standard, we had the collapse of the whole system in the interwar period with the Great Depression and the end of the gold standard. And then we had the Bretton Woods system right after World War II. And there's no real name for the system we have now, except that it's a system based on flexibility and cooperation and management of the system, rather than have a set of fixed rules that everybody has to live by. So we have this flexible post-Bretton Woods system. And in a way, that's the end of history, right? Because there's no other system that can follow from that. All you can do is either make this system work better or move backwards. And some people say, oh, let's go back to the gold standard. But, you know, that would be the wrong thing to do.
Sure. Making
the system we have work better is what we need to focus on. And that's what I think people are focused on. And if we continue to do that, I think the system can be saved.
Great. James, this has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for
It's always great fun
being on
Good
the
to
show.
See you.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in. You've been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with James Boughton on the topic of the international financial system and whether or not it can be saved.
And every effort to try to fix it has not really taken us very far. And I think what people are coming to realize is that the threats to economic growth and stability in the world are not confined to the poorer countries. They affect all of us. They affect Canada, they affect the United States, they affect Europe and the developed parts of Asia as well. So it's a threat to everybody, and I think that now is really the time for people to...
Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of international affairs here to the studio in Waterloo. Today, my guest is James Boughton. He is a senior fellow here at CIGI as well.
Take a closer look at what can be done about it.
And in the paper that you recently wrote for CIGI with the title, The International Financial System, Can It Be Saved? You point to the 1970s as a really critical moment in the history of international finance. What happened in the 70s that was so important?
Well, what happened in the 70s was a collapse of the system that had been set up in the 1940s. At the end of World War...
And the former historian for the International Monetary Fund. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Andrew. It's good to be here.
James, I wonder if we could just start asking, what is broken with the international financial system? What is the current landscape looking like?
The current landscape is, I think most people agree, is not very favorable. We've had 40 years of instability in international finance, and